Recently, I have been going through the book of Isaiah for my devotion. And in about chapter 6, just at the end, it speaks about the oak and the terebinth tree. I read it and I kept going, and I felt a nudge to go back to the oak tree. I said, "What are you trying to show me from this, Lord?" And he said, "I want you to know more about the oak tree." And I was resisting because a few years ago, a friend called me one day and said, "How are you, Sharon?" And I said, "Actually, I'm really well, thank you." And they said, "Okay, I believe I have a word for you. And notwithstanding what you've just told me, I think it's important I share it with you still." And they said, "God said to tell you, you are an oak tree. And when the storm comes, it is going to batter you. But when it passes, you will still be standing." And then 3 days later, that storm hit. Boy, did it hit. And it was a storm that completely uprooted me. So the oak tree was not something I wanted to visit, but I did. And what do you do when you are told to research something? You go to Google, and that's what I did. I went to Google and I just typed in English oak because we're in England. The first thing I saw was the Turner oak tree. So many of you may know about the Turner oak tree, but it was news to me. I'd never heard of it. And now I saw this 5-minute BBC video telling me about this Turner oak tree that was in Kew Gardens. At the time, it was just about 200 years old. It was looking like it was a bit ill. And while oak trees live to see many centuries, this one looked like it wasn't going to live as long as others had, because it was showing signs of age. And so then comes the storm, the great storm of 1987, which hit the southeast quite suddenly. And this storm felled 15 million trees were taken out by this storm, which is staggering. And one of these trees was the Turner oak tree. The manager of the Arboretum was emotional speaking about it on camera, because he had cared for this really special oak tree for such a long time. And now when he saw it listing on its side, having been completely uprooted, he was devastated. He was devastated. I suppose for him it was like losing a pet. But they now had this huge task of cleaning up all of these trees, and they knew it was going to take a long time for that to happen. And so, because I imagine he was so emotionally attached to this tree, he said to his colleagues, "Well, let us go and cut down all the other trees, and we'll come back to the Turner oak tree at the end." And so that's what they did. But because of the size of the task, it took them 3 years to clean up all those trees, well, to cut them down. And then they came back to the Turner oak tree. And when they came back to it, this tree that was listing on one side, which they had propped up at the time just so it wouldn't fall over completely, was now not just alive, but thriving, and had grown 30% more than when before the storm hit. They couldn't understand it. Eventually, they came to realize there was not enough air getting to the roots because of all the people walking around the tree constantly. It had compacted the earth so much that it was no longer possible for air to get down to the root system. And so now they realized, we need to find a way to get air to the root of this tree. And not just to the Turner oak tree, but to the other trees in the Kew Garden, which they realized had also been affected in a similar way. And that started a whole process of thinking, how can we do this? And people got creative, as people do when there's a need, and they invented a machine that could inject air into the ground to allow it to get to roots. Amazing. And because of the Turner oak tree and this newfound technology, they were able to save not just the other trees in the Kew Garden, but people across the world then started using that technology and saving trees. So because of this one tree that appeared to have been dead, and in fact was dying before the storm, this storm came, swept through, and because the dirt had been stirred up, having been uprooted, in the process of it being uprooted, it allowed the dirt to get the air that it so vitally, desperately needed. And that allowed the tree to live and thrive. And so many other trees across the world were saved because of this one tree. And when I think of that story, I really often go back to the story of Joseph in Genesis. And I thought of how he was, one moment he was a happy son, favored son even, and then the next moment he was in captivity. He'd been sold, enslaved, and I just love that story. God was using Joseph even in the times before he became prime minister. In so many different ways we saw how God used him where he was. And only God can do that. So I know that in this time of real challenge that we have had over these months and are still having, it has not been easy. Some of us have lost much. Some of us are hurting much. But God is able to use us in all the seasons of our lives. Whether we are one of those who in this time has struggled, but we're sort of getting on our feet, whether we are one of those who have taken up the challenge and in so many ways have found creative ways of doing things differently, of drawing closer to God, of changing things that we never thought possibly we would change. But here we've seen where good has come out of a time of challenge for some of us. And for others of us, we have been completely uprooted, and we are still uprooted. But God wants us to know today that wherever we find ourselves, that Him for whom nothing is impossible, who does things in a mysterious way, He is still able to use us to bless and save many. God bless you.